a crucial aspect of our analysis. And so this session is about how to analyze cost and finance in education, in an education sector diagnosis. So what I want to do here is to provide an overview on the usefulness of the cost financing analysis in an education sector. So in other words, why are we doing this analysis? And then 2 more points about how we do the analysis. So what are the main issues and indicators? And third, where do we find the information to inform our questions and our indicators? So why do we need this analysis? So I think the overarching objective of this analysis is really to think about establishing a better coherence between education sector policy and education finance. And here we have 2 underlying questions. The one is, do we have enough funding to reach our policy objectives? And number 2, is our funding allocated in the right manner to reach our education policy objectives? So we will look into these 2 items. And this is also to feed the policy dialogue on the future direction of educational finance and this really important issue of resource allocation. So the policy dialogue between government as the main actor, of course, in educational finance. Much of in all countries, the majority of the funding comes from the government, but also other national stakeholders, civil society, international partners involved in education, and some of which contributing to educational finance in our country. And also third, to have a basis for the financial projections. So this is more about allocating, more about finding inconsistencies in the resource allocation that we would want to remedy in the future. And on the basis of what we think is to be changed in our resource allocation, we then have a basis for doing our financial projections. And of course, in our analysis, we would want to come forward with recommendations on how to improve the resource allocation to education and within the education sector. So, and there's a small, you see here on my PowerPoint, there's a small line, use international comparisons to make education expenditure and finance strategies more effective. So this is a methodological element that we often use because sometimes it's not easy to understand what is the right number and how can we argue for certain values, for instance, share of budget, share of the GDP that should go to education, and here often we look into international comparison, we look into benchmarks to argue, yes, maybe our country is underinvesting in education and should allocate more. So we look also, we take reference to international comparisons. Okay, so here is a question for you, and I would like you to raise your hands to provide your inputs. Do you think that in your country there is a good linkage between education policy and budgetary allocations? Do you think that, in other words, that your budgetary allocations are well aligned to the objectives of your education policy? Now let me stop sharing so that I can see who is raising his or her hand. So I see George Mukose. George, what do you think? Perhaps you remind me of your country.
Thank you so much. I don't think that in my country there is a good linkage between policy and budgetary allocations. You find that in our education system, we have four major levels. We have early childhood education, we have primary, we have secondary, and then tertiary institutions. When you look at, for example, the early childhood education, it is basically in the hands of the private sector. And you know, this forms the foundation of education. Now, when it is left into the hands of the private sector, it means that the private people are going to determine what is going to be happening in those schools. And there is very little monitoring on part of Ministry of Education. And that is a major challenge. Then when you come to primary education, we started the UPA in 1997. And when you look at, for example, how much a child would get, it would get about 9,000 shillings is about $3. Now, when you look at $3, educating a child for a term, this is far below the required amount of money that would cater for the needs of a child in the school. When we started the use in 2007, universal secondary education, a child was given 47,000. 47,000 is far below what we would call the minimum cost for a child, educating a child at secondary level. So you find for us here, the policy of, okay, a policy like use can come, but when you look at the budget that goes into it, we had even to ask for the participation of private schools. Now, these private schools, of course, they are business oriented. And for them, even when they were given money, they again had to levy extra charges on the fees, and the burden went to the parents. So here, I think there is no proper alignment between education policy and then budgetary allocation. Thank you.
Yeah, George, so I suppose that you are speaking from Uganda or from Kenya?
I'm speaking from Uganda, the
You're
Pearl of
speaking
Africa.
from Uganda. Okay, yeah, very interesting.
Uganda,
They're all very relevant. So we have some levels of education where we have traditionally a high level of privatization, like early childhood education, but it's also true in many countries for the Tibet sector. It is, early childhood education is now in many countries a priority. It has moved very much into the front with the SDGs, and SDG 4. So early childhood education is in many countries a priority now to develop it, and yet it is often heavily underfunded. So what you say reflects also the reality in many other countries, George. So very interesting. Huh? Do we have any other colleague who would like to, maybe does it resonate with you what George said, or is it very different in your country? Maybe we can hear from somebody else. It would be great. So Priyanti, please.
Okay.
Take the floor.
Okay. In my country, we have free education policy. Because of that, from primary classes up to higher education is entirely free. But we see that there are those who cannot afford, it's okay. But I think there should be some kind of there are some people who can afford education. So if we divert our finances along that way, we can get the maximum utilization out of those funds. Because, for example, we are giving free textbooks for children and free uniforms, but if we can give those to actually only who need those things, and rest of the money we can ask the parents to pay some amount or some quota system, or for those who can afford, we can give the chance. Then we can utilize the money for actual, there are some needy situations where we can divert that money to that. So there is a problem whether we are allocating money to the actual needs, where our country needs to go. That question is now in the context. So I think we should, as planners, we should think along those lines. But this may become a very drastic change. So people should be aware. Because we are comparing with other similar countries. By this, if we adhere to this, our country would be a much developed country in future. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Priyanti. I think this is very relevant again, what you are saying. So this is relating to the issue of equitable resource allocation. We know that in most countries, resource allocation is skewed to the richer segments of the education of the society, because they are benefiting more and longer from education. Most of them make it to higher levels of education. So they are benefiting, while they are the richer segments in the society, they are benefiting from more investment in education than the poorer segments of the society. So in a way, what you are saying, I mean, it raises a very interesting question about equitable resource allocation. And if you think that achieving equity of outcomes is one of the top priorities of our education systems, then of course, resource allocation and the right way to allocate resources is a very crucial point. Now, let me go. So I think we have seen that there is some problems. It's not so easy to allocate resources aligned to education sector policy. Often we use budgets which are just reconducted from one year to the other, adjusted for inflation, but not adjusted to new policy objectives, or this is taking place only over time with a time lag. So now let me go back to my presentation. Okay, maybe I have to, yeah, can you see it? Are we on the right page?
I'm not seeing your presentation yet, Michaela.
Not, is this coming? Should be coming.
Maybe you can try again, because I am not seeing your presentation at all.
Okay, let me then go back to Zoom and then, okay. Now
yes, now I can see your screen.
You can see my screen and I make it full
yes.
screen. Are we on the right side? Do I need to change the
No,
pages?
it's perfect. We can see it perfectly. Thank you.
We can
okay.
see it, please.
Yeah, okay. So then let me move forward. Now, so basically the questions that we ask analyzing cost and financing in an education sector diagnosis are very simple. They are quite intuitive. So here are the questions. There are 4 questions. So how much is spent on education? Oh, sorry. How much is spent on education? So what is the volume of money that we are spending on education? Who pays for it? So in other words, where is the funding coming from? What are the sources of funding? Number 3, for what is the funding allocated? And a 4th question, we have tackled that a tiny bit in our discussion already. How efficient and effective are resources allocated to the education sector? So how much, who pays for what, and how efficient and effective are resources allocated? And when we do this analysis, we are basing ourselves on and when we're doing this analysis of the first question, how much is spent, we are basing ourselves on monetary expenditure. So the number of units of currency actually paid for the delivery of education. So in terms of, our currency, how much do we spend on services, on goods, on which for the delivery of education in terms of staff salaries, buildings, equipment, school uniforms. And not only by the government, so by the public sector, but also by private entities. So ideally, and here this is where the difficulties sometimes come in, we would like to know whoever it is in our country, and including also external partners, contribute to the funding of education to have the fullest picture possible. But then there's also the notion of opportunity cost. So opportunity cost is actually a little bit more a complex notion, is a little bit more abstract. Opportunity cost is actually the foregone income because of education. So it's something which is a little bit more theoretical. So for instance, here is an example. John is a student at the university. His family has to spend $3,000 every year to cover fees and other educational expenditure. So the monetary expenditure for John and his family is $3,000. That's very easy. Now the opportunity cost. While John is at the university, he could also go out and earn an annual salary, which could be in the order of $5,000. So the opportunity cost for John's education is then the monetary expenditure, the $3,000, plus the foregone earning of $5,000, which brings the opportunity cost to $8,000. So sometimes the notion of opportunity cost comes in when we think about people making educational choices. Basically meaning me as an individual, do I go to the next level of education, or do I go to the labor market and make a living? And so this notion of opportunity cost also comes in and can actually have an impact on how actors, how families react to the continuation of their education trajectories. So this is just for the notion of opportunity cost. So now here comes the next question. How much is spent on education in relative terms? So the issue here is how much of its wealth, as measured by the gross domestic product, the GDP, does a country spend on education? So this, through this indicator, the main indicator being here education expenditure as a percentage of gross domestic product. And this is a very important indicator because it tells us about a nation's, or let's say a country's effort to education, a country's effort that is made to education. And the relationship, let's say, looking at how the GDP will evolve in the future, gives us also information of whether we can expect increased revenue for the government, which then affects its public income, and then also its capacity to spend on education. And at the same point in time, an increase in the GDP has also benefits for individuals, because it means also that more salaries are distributed in a country, and it means also that there are more private resources available for education. But looking at the how the GDP is likely to evolve, what is the expected growth rate of the GDP, tells us only about the potential. It means that these possibly supplementary resources could possibly, but are not necessarily, spent on education. So this is why a close look at the GDP and how it will evolve, measured through the GDP growth rate, is an important element. Now, here comes a question on Mentimeter that we would like to ask on Mentimeter. Amaranta, I pass it to you. I will stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Michaela. I can help you out. Okay.
Yeah, I don't know why it's
Okay. Okay, so I hope you can all see my screen now. We have already 2 replies. However, if you're working from your mobile, you can scan the QR code, or otherwise go to www.menti.com and enter the code 92476630. I'll give you just a couple of seconds for the people who haven't joined yet Mentimeter. So you can either go to menti.com and enter the code that you can see on the screen, or if you're on your mobile, you just scan the QR code. Okay. So I'm going to close this, and we can see that some people have already replied. 4 people have replied. 5 people. We'll wait a couple of seconds so more of you can reply this question on Mentimeter. If you cannot find the way to logging into Mentimeter, you can also go to the chat and you have the link and the code on the chat. Okay, I don't know, Michaela, if you want to start commenting on the replies that we can already see on the screen.
Yeah, okay, so we have actually a wide spread here. So we have, I see 5 responses, and if I may say that, because it's only 2, concentrated on the 3 to 4% bar. So yeah, so it's quite interesting, because what we see internationally is that the share that is allocated to education out of the GDP varies a lot between countries. So what we see internationally is a broad range of 2 to 10%. But I should also mention that there is an international benchmark for this, and I think that is very useful, and it relates to what I said earlier. Meaning that often it's useful to argue from, let's say, from international benchmarks when you are doing your education sector analysis, and when you are, you know, arguing for certain conclusions on indicators. We have an international benchmark, which is the allocation of 4 to 6% out of the education budget to the GDP of the education budget, which is the benchmark mentioned in the Education 2030 framework, which provides the framework for the implementation of SDG 4. So I think that is quite interesting. And I can see that, well, there are 2, let's say there are, oh yeah, okay, we have now 1 more. So we have, let's say, 4 of the 6 who have responded would be within this range. And the 2 other ones, 1 to 2 and 2 to 3, who are not. So you could argue, you could say, well, we have this framework, and if you were to do this analysis, you would say, yes, we need to spend more to education, on education out of the GDP. Okay, thank you very much, Amaranta. Then if you can
yes, I'll stop sharing and back to you. Yes,
then I go back to share the screen. Okay. Okay, share. Okay, so is it fine?
Yes, perfect. Thank you,
Yes.
Michaela.
Okay, good. Okay, so we have also another indicator which is often cited on the question on how much is spent on education in relative terms. This is how much of the total government budget a country is spending on education. So the indicator education budget as a percentage of total government budget. So what we have to acknowledge is that when government prepares budgets, they're different. The different portfolios or different sectors in competition with each other. More recently, we have of course seen that health is probably one of the sectors that has been prioritized more recently under the COVID-19 pandemic. The share that is given to education out of the total public budget really demonstrates the effort that the government is making to education out of its public funds. And again, here we have a benchmark, which is again from the Education 2030 framework, which is that 15 to 20% of the total public budget should be allocated to education. So again, another quite interesting benchmark. So moving to the question of who pays. Also, before we were discussing, so where's the funding, what is the global volume and how is it allocated? Now the question is who pays? And so the typical funding sources that we find is governmental funding, so public budget. So government meaning Ministry of Education, but sometimes also other ministries. In many countries, we have a number of ministries providing funding for education, but also decentralized funding. So sometimes it's funding that comes from the Ministry of Interior that is directly allocated to decentralized units and using then the funding for education. We have private resources, parents' contribution in kind, school fees, sometimes also sponsorships from enterprises to education or to educational institutions. We have external sources of fundings. We can have project funds from development partners. Sometimes we have program support that is given by development partners to our education programs. We can have multi-donor basket funds, so a kind of agglomeration of development partner funds that is then given to the government budget, or we can have sector budget support, development partners funding the education sector, or general budget support, which is funding going to the, let's say, Prime Minister's budget and then is allocated to the different sectors. So external funding can be given under different modalities and makes it sometimes a little bit complex to get a full picture. Now, here are some questions that we will need to analyze when we do education sector diagnosis, analyzing cost and finance. So, what is the relative share of public versus private financing? So sometimes we invite private partners to avoid budget deficits, to avoid increased poverty and inequality, but do we have a good balance here? What is the balance between central level versus decentralized funding? Again, the issue is here how to avoid wastage and how to avoid also growing geographical disparities. The higher level of decentralization we have in budget allocation, the less control actually we have over regional disparities, because this, of course, you know, is one of the main objectives as well in an education sector, to make sure that there is schooling of similar quality levels across the education, across the country's territories, and it is not the relative wealth of a region that dominates the quality of schooling. So we have to watch this issue as well. And then the issue of national versus external funding. So we would want to avoid too high debts if the external funding comes via loans, and of course a growing dependency on external funders. So what I want to say here is in the question who pays, there are a number of balances that we have to look into and that we have to analyze. Now, let me just, here I bring all the different elements in one go. So actually, the question of who pays is quite a complex one. It sounds relatively simple. Of course, when we look into the broad actors, yes, government actors, private actors, and external actors. But when it comes to pinning it down, and here I'm thinking from the point of view, again, of education sector diagnosis, you have to bring all this information together, it can become quite complex. So just to show here, of course, we will have funding that comes from the Ministry of Education that goes possibly via decentralized units like the education offices directly to educational institutions, schools, but we may have also direct private sector contributions directly to schools. We could have also international NGOs that are funding schools directly. We may also have internally generated funds at the school levels. Maybe they are raising fees. The parents are making direct contributions to the schools. And we may have the regional and local government authorities also making contributions to schools. So when we are making our analysis, we need to take into account all this. And I just want to pause here a little bit and ask a question to you. Just take a look at this graphic and tell me whether you think it's complete. Would it reflect the reality in your country, or do we have even some missing items here? So what I want from you here is a kind of critical engagement with this graph, and tell me whether that reflects your reality. So I leave it some 10 seconds and then I have to unshare because I have to see who raises, or maybe Amaranta, can you tell me whether someone raises his or her hand?
Of course.
So that we can stay with this, so I do not need to.
Yes, of course. Well, for the moment, I don't see anybody raising its hand.
So maybe one question, do you think the Ministry of Education is enough here?
If you want to comment on that, please raise your hand so we can see you and give you the floor. Okay, George has raised his hand. Please, you have the floor.
Yes.
Yes, when you look at our system, this is a reflection of what happens in Uganda. What you look at, for example, university education, over 60% of the universities in Uganda are private. So the funding is actually coming from the private sector. Of course, through the parents who contribute the funds. And when you come to government, for example, what we are doing at university level, we have started what we call the students' loan scheme. And you look at the way it is funded, it is very interesting because now government is looking at industrialization, and they think that if they promoted science, then it would drive economic development. So what the government has decided is to lend money to students who are going to universities. And here they are using both government universities and also private universities, the universities that are accredited, so that the students who are doing science courses can go to these universities, and then when they finish their courses, they can pay back the money. So you find that even government participation at that level is in terms of funding or financing, the mechanism there is as amorphous as that. And when it comes to these other lower lower levels of education. As I mentioned earlier on, the early childhood education entirely, government is out of it. It is the private sector, and that is how money is coming in through NGOs, through individuals who have money to begin these nursery schools. Yes, this is a reflection of what is happening. We see money coming from external funding. For example, when we started the use in 2007, World Bank had to come in to give support to the implementation of the youth program. And they are also doing the same in the universal primary education. So, but maybe here, what I can comment is that we have very little coming from the regional and the local government authorities. Actually, basically here, our local governments are doing basically monitoring, but in terms of financing, very little is coming from the local governments. Otherwise, this one sheds a picture of what is happening in our education system here in Uganda. I submit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you very much, George. So you confirm that this reflects your reality, and so you related very interestingly to what's happening in higher education. So I think it was really interesting. You mentioned NGOs. Yes, one could have added them here, the NGOs, but one can also assume that they are covered by the private sector. I think I would have also thought about other ministries than the Ministry of Education. Sometimes I'm thinking about a sector like Cambodia. You have 30 different ministries involved in funding higher education institutions because there are many different ministries, and every ministry is funding their own higher education institutions. So ministries of health, they have their own training institutions for nurses and doctors and the like. So you can have other ministries than the Ministry of Education, but I would say ministries of education in a way which could solve the issue. Any more comment here from anyone?
I don't see any other hand raised.
Okay, then. Yeah, okay, so then let me move on. The main point here that I wanted to make from this slide is really to underline the complexity of different actors and actually information sources that we need to pull together if we want to do a comprehensive analysis of educational cost and finance. So this shows the complexity of it. So then let me move on to the next slide. Okay, so that's what we have looked at. Now, here comes the question, paying for what? And one of the related issues is how much goes to the different levels, subsectors of education. George, in your intervention, you mentioned already the different subsectors, in Uganda, from early childhood to primary, and then secondary and tertiary education. And you were already problematizing a little bit, the issue of, how much is going actually to these different levels, and that there was an inconsistency with educational policy and maybe also educational priorities as you see this. So here the indicator that we would always look into is the share of the education budget that goes to, well, it says here only primary, but it should also say pre-primary, primary, lower secondary, upper secondary, and tertiary education. And whether this is balanced, whether it is aligned with the priorities of our education policy. And also, again, paying for what type of expenditure and cost are incurred? Is it long-term investment or not? So this brings with it the question of the share of educational funding that goes to capital expenditures. So this is the expenditures for goods and services used over a long period, for instance, the purchase of land, construction of buildings, purchase of heavy equipment versus recurrent expenditures, which is the yearly budget, and the expenditures for goods and services of which immediate use is made and renewal in 1 year or less. So for instance, recurrent expenditure, as you know, goes typically to staff salaries, the purchase of textbooks, small equipments, electricity supplies. So these are the two broad types of expenditures. And often they are not under the same budget. So in some, let's say, for instance, in Francophone countries, we have a Ministry of Planning that is typically in charge of the capital expenditure. So if we wanted to find out the full cost of education, we would need to go to the Ministry of Planning and to collect data on the capital expenditure. Whereas the Ministry of Education or education involved ministries would be able to provide us with information on recurrent expenditures. Oh, and we have a distinction, we need to make a distinction between fixed and variable costs. So fixed cost in education, as in any other area, is the cost that is not sensitive to here in education, the enrollments or the number of beneficiaries. For instance, a fixed cost is in insurance. Whatever the number of children enrolled in education, if there is a basic insurance that needs to be made that is not based on schools, of course, the number of schools varies, of course, by the number of children, that is fixed cost. Variable cost is the cost that varies with the enrollment of the number of beneficiaries. For example, teacher salaries and textbook expenditures. The more children we have in our system, of course, the more teachers we need and the more the textbooks we need, as they are, of course, related to, they need to be available for every child, ideally. And coming to the question, paying for what? So there's also the issue on what we spend our educational budget. So how much is spent on staff remuneration and how much is left for other activities related to the delivery of educational services? And the related question, what is the right balance between the two? Because in many systems, we find a skew towards staff salaries, staff remunerations, and often not enough funding being left for for pedagogical resources and also pedagogical innovation. So it's this kind of a very high share of expenditure being spent on staff salaries, stifles the education system and doesn't allow innovation to take place. So that is often an issue. So this is why we would like you to go to Mentimeter again and answer another question. In your country, how much funding is left for current expenses other than staff salaries? So I will unshare here the screen and put it to Amaranta.
Thank you, Michaela. Perfect. I'm sharing my screen right now. Again, you can go to menti.com and enter the code that you had at the bottom of the screen, or otherwise you have the code as well on the chat. If you're on your mobile, then I will give you some minutes to scan the QR code and to have access to Mentimeter. And you can also have the link over here, www.menti.com with the code 92476630. Okay, well, I hope if you have your mobile, you have scanned the code. I'm going back to the question. So in your country, how much funding is left for current expenses other than staff salaries? And we have one person that has replied. I'll give you couple of seconds to
Two.
reply. 2 people have replied, yes. If you have any trouble logging into menti.com, please let me know on the chat. Okay.
Okay, we have 2 answers.
To answer.
Between 10 and 20%.
Oh,
Oh,
3
less than
answers.
10%. Oh, wow. Yeah. Yeah. Interesting, huh? Yeah. Anyone else who would know? Of course, you all now experts in Mentimeter.
Let's see, we can have a little bit more people to reply. We have 4 for the moment. If you have any problem logging into menti.com, please let me know. If you can't have access to Mentimeter, then maybe you can drop your reply on the chat. Otherwise, go to menti.com and use the code that you see on the top of the screen. You have the information as well in the chat. Oh, 5 people.
Okay, another one, so 5. Yeah, actually, okay, I think the trend is quite clear. I think it confirms a problem that I have. The problem that I have indicated is that most countries spend, on average, 80% of their funding on salaries, both teaching salaries and non-teaching staff salaries, and that typically leaves relatively little for other expenditure. And then in particular, anything related to educational innovation, trying out new pedagogical methods, implementing a new curriculum and the related staff development that is necessary. So it shows actually that this high reliance or this high level of allocation to staff salaries often stifles educational systems. So, and this is an issue, of course, that that we have in many countries, and this is something that you would need to look into also in the education sector diagnosis. So 6 responses. So I mean, and all 6, we can say from 0 to 20% is left for anything else but salaries. It's quite confirming the issue. 7 even. Okay. Yeah, Yaman Mustafa says that he couldn't manage Mentimeter. Okay, Amaranta, thank you so much.
Thank you, Michaela.
And then I have to go back and share the screen. Okay, can you see it?
Perfectly, thank you.
Okay, and then let
Yes,
me
we can see.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. So now is the issue of what are the major data sources that we can tap into to actually respond to these questions that I have raised. So number 1, there is, of course, the executed, often audited government budget. This is different from the planned budget. So what we typically look into is the executed government budget, the money that has really been spent, because between what was planned to spend and what has been spent, there may be quite a discrepancy. Household surveys is very important to investigate about the private, let's say the household contribution to education. I mentioned either fees that are to be spent, that have to be paid, or other resources, purchase of textbooks, maybe school uniforms. Sometimes there are a lot of administrative fees, and often, and here I have to underline this, often we have an imperfect view actually on what the families spend on education. It can be sometimes a very high share, and if we do not do the supplementary analysis of household data, trying to investigate what the parents, what the families are spending, we can have a very incomplete picture of what is actually spent on education in a country. So we have colleagues at IAP that did a very interesting research on national educational accounts, investigating 8 countries and actually pulling together a methodology to kind of look into all the different resources that are contributed to education and how to aggregate them for a complete picture on educational expenses. I think that was a very useful research, and it showed that the contribution of families is often highly underestimated. So, and then we can also use information from school censuses, providing the yearly school census. Schools provide information on their expenditures, which is very interesting. So we can see what is actually what is coming from private resources at the school level and what is coming from public resources at the school level. We can tap into administrative laws and regulation, for instance, see what are the regulations on concerning school and training fees. So this is, gives us a good indication on this type of expenditure. Audited accounts of government institutions. So this is another thing, you know, when you have, for instance, I know it very well as I'm a higher education specialist, you know, you have so many government agencies working in the higher education sectors. It's probably similar at the school level, but for instance, we have a quality assurance agency. We have a national council for higher education. At the school level, we may have National Institute for Educational Research, Institute for Curriculum Development, Pedagogic Innovation. So all these government institutions are making contributions to the education sector, and their audited accounts then also have to be looked into. Private and NGO reports to better understand what they contribute to education, and of course also the development partners reports on externally funded projects. So all have to be pulled together to construct a complete as possible picture on educational cost and finance. So this gives you an idea about, you know, on the one hand, we have very simple question. So how much is spent on education? By whom? For what? Is it used in an effective and an efficient manner? But to respond to these questions is immensely complicated. Now, here comes our last question. How effective and efficient is our resource allocation? So just a notion, a little bit, the notion of efficiency, I think you know probably. So efficiency basically means attaining targeted outputs with the lowest possible cost, at the lowest price, in other words. So the lowest mix, mix of cost items to achieve a set number of goals and objectives. And so what we are using here as proxy indicators is unit costs. For instance, the unit cost of primary education. Unit cost of primary education can be a very complex notion as well. Typically, when we simplify it, we take simply the public education budget, and we divide it by the number of pupils in a given year enrolled, for instance, in primary education. So then we have a very rough estimate of the unit cost in primary education. But that is only very rough, because the unit cost of primary education in principle should also take into account capital cost, for instance, the construction of schools, you know, and there you enter into issues like, you know, how do we allocate the construction cost of a school on a yearly basis to a given pupil. And it can be sometimes a little bit tricky. There are methodologies for this, but it's not such an easy thing. So the unit cost, you can calculate it in very simple terms, but if you do it if you try to be more precise, it can become quite complex as well. Another indicator is the average number of cost of student years required to produce a primary secondary graduate. So that relates, you will remember it, to the analysis of internal efficiency, where we have suggested this indicator. So through cohort analysis, we analyze the average number of years it takes to graduate a primary school leaver. So there's a theoretical number of years, which could be 5 years, say it's 5 years, but given the number of repetitions of children and also the number of dropouts that we have to allocate the years spent also to the average number it takes to graduate a primary school leaver. And so here we get another item, another benchmark for analyzing the efficiency of our education system. So here comes an interesting question, and that relates a little bit to the initial discussions we had about, the relationship between budgetary allocation and education policy objectives. So in your country, what is the multiplier between the unit cost for primary education and higher education? In other words, what is the multiplier between primary and higher education? So higher education is typically more costly than primary education because of the staff salaries. We are dealing here with more advanced experts, university professors. There may be also student support that is provided to students, which is typically not the case at the primary level. So higher education is more costly. But what is in your country the relationship between the cost of a primary student to the cost of a higher education student? So I will unshare Amaranta and
thank you, Michaela.
Manage the Mentimeter again. Huh?
Yes, of course. Okay, sharing my screen right now. I hope you can all see my screen. So don't forget, you can go to menti.com and type the code 92476630. We have one person that has already replied. If you have any problem logging into Mentimeter, please let me know on the chat.
So one says lower than 3, one says between 3 and 5.
Okay, 3 people have replied. 2 said between 3 and 5.
So we have some experts here in cost and finance. Okay, 4. Some are still reflecting, maybe.
Okay. Let's see, we can have more than 5. Yes, we have now 7. Perfect.
1. Wonderful. Oh, great, huh? Yeah, so we have 8 responses now.
Yes, perfect.
Okay, that looks quite interesting. So we can see that there is a quite a good how would I call it? Dispersed. It's quite dispersed. What we see here. So one says lower than 3, which I think is about reasonable, let's say, relationship between the cost of a student in primary and the cost of a student in tertiary. 5, even 6, 3 and 5. which I think is, here we are coming to something which is not so reasonable, and more than 7 is really quite squeezed towards higher education. Why is it so? And I think that relates really to the fact that in higher education, I have to say that I have to admit this while I'm a higher education specialist and very much in favor of higher education. But when we have a relationship of 1 to 7 between primary education, which forms really the basis of an education system, and higher education, then this is quite, then we can see that higher education gets a lot of funding. And in higher education, of course, we have typically the better of segments of the society. Not exclusively, but and far from exclusively, but there is typically a higher share of the better of segments in society. So that basically means that we have also an education system where the wealthier benefit much more from education and from public resources to education typically than the less well-off segments in society. So that is problematic, and that brings us back to the issue of equitable resource allocation. Of course, in higher education, the issues which drive the cost to higher education, on the one hand, of course, the higher salaries of teachers. This, to a certain extent, I think, is justified. Higher education teachers, they have often gone through very lengthy training. So in a way, it's quite justified that they have higher salaries. But then it's often at times the student support, which is very costly. For instance, in Francophone African countries, student support systems, they make up for something like 50% of the funding allocated to higher education. And there, of course, we have an issue of equitable resource allocation, because some of the higher education students could certainly fund, their own support. So, or the families could fund them, the wealthier families could fund them. So this is really an issue of equitable resource allocation. Okay, thank you very much, Amaranta. Then we move it on.
Thank you, Michaela. Back to you then.
Okay, go back and share. Okay. Okay, so again here, the question, how the definition of unit cost, I have already alerted a little bit to the fact that defining unit cost is not, calculating unit cost is not such a straightforward manner. In the easier definition of the unit cost I mentioned is the cost incurred in general by the government to deliver 1 unit of education, in general 1 year of education to 1 student. So what in the simplest way of the unit cost, we make a division between the yearly budget, public budget allocated to education, and the number of students educated to primary education, and the number of primary school students. But we could also include all fixed costs, the land, equipment, and all variable costs that are involved, and that would make it much more complicated. For instance, just to give you an idea, in higher education, it's even more complicated to calculate unit costs in a, let's say, in a detailed manner, because higher education teachers are supposed to do teaching and research. So what you would need to do is to have an allocation of the time. You would need to know how much time teachers allocate on teaching and on certain programs, because you would calculate the unit cost by program, and research activities, and that can be very complicated exercise as well. Okay, so yeah, here comes another question for debate. The interpretation of unit cost. How do we interpret a high unit cost in, say, primary education. Does it correspond to high quality as well? Do you think it corresponds to high quality?
Okay, George has his hand raised.
George raised his hand. Please,
Yes,
George.
this is very interesting because when we are looking at education and the issue of investment is very important. For me, I would say to a great extent, the unit cost in education, the amount of money that is paid per child will have a very significant effect on the quality of education. When we started the UPE in 1997, we had so many children enrolled in primary. Actually, the number rose from 2.4 million children to 7.8 in 1989. So it means that we had so many children coming to the school, but up to now we are struggling with the issue of quality. And for me, when I look at, for example, we give 20,000 per child, and that means each child is given about 6,000 shillings. 6,000 shillings, about $3. Now, if you paid, okay, we can say even if you paid $5 per child in primary, honestly, there is little that this $5 can fetch in terms of, because quality goes with the materials, instructional materials. It goes with the books. It goes with the learning environment. It goes with the teaching learning aids that the teacher is using. So for me, I think when the unit cost is high, it may have a lot of influence on the quality of education. And this is what has been happening. And this is, as the Minister of Education, this is what we have been appealing to government. Can we have some increment on the amount of money that we are paying? And it goes across the board. In secondary, a child is given 58,000. That is about we can say about $50, but you can still find that this money is too low to fetch what a child would require to learn and effectively, and therefore improve the quality of education in our country. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, George. Very interesting again. Yeah, so you make a relationship between the presentation that the discussions we had on quality of education and cost and finance. And I think this is very correct. Quality inputs into education are important and they are costly. So definitely the higher the unit cost, the higher the potential, I would say, to achieve good quality outcomes. But are we achieving them? So my point here would be yes. When we have a high unit cost, it gives us good potential to achieve good outcomes, but we need to check also. And we need to correlate our cost and finance analysis actually also with data from that we collect through the quality analysis, and also to see what are the learning achievements in our education sector. So if we can see that we have a high unit cost, at the same point in time, we have also high learning achievements, we can assume, we do not know exactly, but we can assume that the relationship comes actually from the good conditions that a child finds at the school level to follow his or her education. So, but it is a potential. And so as a consequence, unit costs are not as such on their own, are not so easy to interpret. So what we need to do when we analyze unit costs, either we go for time series and we look how the unit cost evolves, whether it is increasing, whether it is decreasing. If it is decreasing, then we can assume that the quality conditions for schooling are deteriorating. If it is increasing, we can assume that they are improving. And then again, we have to correlate it with data that we have on learning achievement to see whether the two go in the same direction, and it gives us an idea of really how the quality of our education is evolving. So I think this is a very important question, and a question that we have to tackle. So it tells us also something about indicators, and often indicators as such are not so easy to interpret. They can mean different things here, like a high unit cost can mean high quality. It can mean also perhaps high wastage. And so often we need to correlate indicators among themselves and analyze them together to come to a more comprehensive picture. Okay, now here I think comes that I'm coming close to the end of my presentation. So this is about the effectiveness of our resource allocation. So what is effectiveness of education investment? It is the relationship between expenditure and targeted results. So in other words, with our resource allocation, do we achieve our targeted results? And targeted results can be, of course, the number of places available or number of children enrolled. And that's what we have been pursuing with UPE, for instance, at the primary education level. The target was to bring all the kids into school. Now the emphasis has shifted to, yes, bringing all the kids into schools, but for quality learning. So we're looking also into the learning achievement, but then also, are we providing equity of outcomes? Are the learning achievements, let's say the quality levels of schooling comparable across our educational territory? And are the results, is there also equity of outcomes? So example here where we could also try to approach this analysis of effectiveness is the percentage of stipends, subsidies that are actually reaching targeted beneficiaries, and the percentage of actual execution of the education budget. So the last item, the actual execution of the education budget, sometimes quite low in some countries, shows us also about the management capacity of the system. But this is a topic that we will tackle in the last unit of our, before last unit of our course on education sector diagnosis. Now, here we have a last question to you. And again, this is, I promise, this is the last Mentimeter question. What do you think are the key characteristics of effective resource allocation in your country? And here I'm unsharing.
Thank you, Elena. Okay. So I hope you can all see my screen. So the question is, what do you think is or are the key characteristics of effective resource allocation in your country? Please go to menti.com and use the code 92476630. One person has replied already. Let's see if we can have more than 6 this time. If you have any problem joining Mentimeter, please give me a comment on the chat and I'll help you. Okay, 2 people have applied. Let's go for 6. Oh, 4 already. 6 already. Okay. Okay, Michaela, I'll give you the floor if you want to start commenting on the answers.
So there is a clear convergence here to the fourth option, 8, and in a way it's quite obvious because in my presentation, in a way, I have already given the answer to this, and I think this is really something which is important to keep in mind, and it's in a way the backbone of what we have to think through when we are looking into cost and finance and for education sector diagnosis. So in a way, are we tackling these 3 questions? Do we achieve, do we bring the greatest number of children into our schools? So of course, in basic education, there's the right to education approach. All should be in school, but we have to be also concerned with learning outcomes and completion, and in addition with equity of outcomes. So I think, yeah, so you all agree with me, which is nice. Okay, thank you very much, Amaranta.
Thank you, Michaela.
And then, yeah, okay. Then I have to share my screen again. And then this brings me actually to the, yeah, so that we have done. So which brings me actually to the last slide, which is the conclusion, and which makes actually the transition to the next unit. So effective and efficient education spending depends on good management. And this is what we will tackle in the next unit. So I leave it here. So thank you for your interest and active participation. Has been a very interesting session. I think we have some experts on educational cost and finance already in our group, so that is great. So it will be easy for you to do the individual assignment as well. Is Laura with us? Then I would.
She just joined the meeting. She's joining the meeting right now, actually. Yes.
That is perfect. So I unshare because Laura will provide a little bit of feedback on the last assignment, and also introduce into the next assignment. So I'm unsharing now, and I pass it to Laura.
Hello. Good
Hello,
morning.
Good to see you.
Hello, everybody.
Yes.
I just joined because I wanted to say hello to everybody, and also I wanted to thank you very much for all the work you have done so far. I had the pleasure to read you, and I wanted to give you a little bit of feedback on that, if that's okay with you. Is that okay with you?
Okay.
Fine, it is fine. We
Yes,
are actually waiting.
Can we see you? Can we see you? We'd like to see you. Ah, that's much better.
Okay. Great.
No, I will be muted. I will be muted. You have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Michaela. So I hope that you are enjoying this module 4. I could see that many of you have submitted the assignment on time by Sunday, and other colleagues have been submitting yesterday as well. So that's great. I just wanted to give you to tell some comments for everybody. I think that can be useful. As you know, the Unit 5 assignment was based on external efficiency. That was the previous topic. And I could see that most of you, or yes, I would say everybody, in fact, to different degrees, but I could see with concrete examples that the idea was to reflect and to analyze on the degree to which the specific tracks or programs in education contribute or not to the economic and social benefits at both levels, at the individual level and the collective level. And I could see a lot of evidence that you have, of course, read the case study and you have interpreted what that meant in very concrete terms. So in this exercise, we had two specific tasks. The first one was to identify the mismatches between the qualifications provided in Vindoland by the education system and the requirements that are very clear by the labor market. So these mismatches between the labor market requirements and qualifications, you observe them with regard to the level of qualifications, with regards to the types of qualifications, and also specializations. And in that table, most participants combined information from the tables that appeared on the case study, on the text, but also the written information, or the more anecdotes, if you want. That was very interesting to see, that you could match, you could associate what were the problems and put your finger on it. So I could see that in some cases, colleagues provided more details or more examples or indicators. In others, there were a bit less. But overall, I could see that the group is well on track. And then there is the second part of the exercise. I have to say that some colleagues forgot to complete the second part. It's what you think about that. It was you were asked to share your thoughts around external efficiency in Vindoland, and the idea was to discuss the extent to which the Vindo education system matched these requirements. And I could see that for those of you who responded, you have shown that the analysis and the explanations support your views that are correct, in fact. I cannot say much more information because there are colleagues who have not yet submitted. So I'm trying to give just a general feedback. But overall, everything I could read was very relevant. And I think that the case study is a bit tricky at some points because you're asked to combine and associate different information with indicators, but I think you understood what we meant by external efficiency and how to analyze that in that specific context. So thanks again to all the colleagues who submitted this assignment on time, and I would like to encourage those who have not yet submitted to do that, so that we can go on. And remember that the second deadline is by tomorrow. It's Wednesday. So again, if you have any question or comment, you can reach out to me or Micaela through the help forum. So thank you very much. Any questions or thoughts, please? George, I can see your hand up.
Yeah, thank you so much for the feedback. I think that is very good. But one, I have a challenge with the help forum because it takes long to get feedback, and sometimes when you are doing an assignment, you may need a prompt feedback. For example, I wanted to know whether we are looking at one mismatch per each of the sections, but I didn't get that feedback. So maybe there could be another way of interacting, which is faster, because sometimes you want a feedback so that you are able to continue with the assignment. Then too, it's about the previous module that we did, module 3, because information was posted that the badges had been given out, and of course this information goes to those that completed the work. Now I assumed that I completed the work because I didn't have any challenge. I thought I had done everything, but when I didn't see that email coming to me, then I suspected that I could have maybe I could have missed out something, and I needed really to know what really happened because I was expecting a badge, and I'm still now I'm still anxious. I wanted to know whether I had a problem with module 3, and if there was a problem, what was it? So that maybe that could have been the reason, so that in future I don't get such a problem. Thank you.
Thank you, George, for sharing. I can see that you have two concerns. The first one is how to communicate better via the help forum. You have asked a question and apparently you did not receive an answer on time. I would suggest that right now I cannot see your question on the help forum. So the first thing would be to check whether you have really posted the question on the help forum, because from my end, I cannot see it, but perhaps it is there. So that would be my first question. Have you succeeded in posting your question in the help forum? Can you see it there? Because I don't. But
I think,
still, yes, please.
I think I submitted that question. Maybe I'll have, because now I can't check, but I can, yeah.
Okay, let us check. But if that doesn't work, you can send me a message via the platform.
Okay.
Right?
I think that is better.
Yes, yes. And now I see it because there's like a little bell somewhere that tells me you've got message. So I can respond to you. The thing with that is that I will be responding to you at a personal basis, and other colleagues will not be able to read the answer or your question. But that's okay. You can reach out to me via the help forum or the messages, and there is also a message, you know, that we have the Outlook, the TEP mailbox. That is still another one that arrives at the IIP account, and that is the Outlook. Yeah, that can also be useful. So that is the first question. The second question is the badge. Unfortunately, I do not have an answer to your question at this point, but I will check what is going on and I will come back to you. Is that okay, George? I'm sorry about the badge.
It's fine, it's fine. It's fine.
Let me check and come back to you with a proper answer. Because, yeah, thank you. Agustin, I can see your hand up too. Over to you.
It's a type of a quick question, and it's happened to other colleagues, is with respect to the when we have the case, the example case for this wind on land. So sometimes it's really easy or inadvertently to just move or transform Winterland in your own reality, and you start writing a sentence. It's not Winterland anymore. So my point is, in what type of extent are you find relevant or useful to insert or something or our own reality into the Winterland case, just to fill in the gaps of or the pieces of information that they are missing? That I don't know if I explain it correctly, but how much of our own reality do you want to see in the responses, or you want us really to focus on the information that is in the case or in the sample case, and not adding anything else from our imagination or from the reality that we know? I'm get, because when I do a second read on what I'm writing, say, well, this is, but probably this is nothing related to Winter, and I taking so much of other places. So just having this.
That is an excellent question, Agustin. Excellent question. Yes, you're totally right. There are, I think there are a couple of assignments where we ask, for example, in the first one, we asked your views according to your own country. But in the other assignments, we are basically focused on Vindoland. And what you can see, the analysis, the information, and that you can apply what Micaela has been presenting in these live sessions on the theoretical part of it to apply it to that grid. It's on Vinderland, those concepts to that very specific and I would say particular context of this case study. I could see that some colleagues have put some of their views concerning their own countries or other countries. That is okay, but it's not really the focus. It's not required. I would like to see more. You're not penalized for sharing your thoughts about your country, but you are not expected to do that at this point. You're more expected to try to understand what is going on in Vinderland and analyze this education sector through different angles. That's what we try to do in each unit. Michaela, I can see your hand up too, please.
Yeah, Laura, just to confirm, you're absolutely right. So this is really an exercise to rely as much as possible on the information that is in the case study. So, and sometimes there's missing information, you're absolutely right, but this is the case in if you did such an exercise in your own country, you would also be confronted with missing information. So that is a reality, and we try to be as analytic and evidence-based as possible. Now, when it comes to analyzing relationships, of course, we have all our own understandings, which we then project into the analysis. We know how things correlate and what are the cause-effect relationships in our own system. And many a times they work the same across systems, but we have to be careful. We have to be aware that when we are doing analysis, we are sometimes projecting also our understandings into a different country, which is not necessarily the case. So I think this is an excellent question that you're raising. And in a way, I think it brings us also to, making the point of being watchful, that we're not projecting ourselves too much about our understandings into another country. So to be as evidence-based as we can and rely on the information that we have, So that's really that's an important point. Yeah.
Thank you. I think this is important to have a second read and remove all the elements that are no Winterland related on the topic. I want to make a final question, but it's related from the topic on today, and I probably can interest it to other colleagues. It's just a recent a strong hit debate here in Fiji, which is related to the government just removed the school fees for students, and the parent association are engaging in what they call fundraising activities. So there's a really strong debate about this, the permission or not permission, or the limits for this fundraising activities. So it's a whole debate with the government and the position and all the teachers association and parents association that the parents wants to keep their rights to continue with these activities, but they also realize that in the schools that they through these fundraising activities they increase so much the funding of schools. There are really high difference with other schools that not engage in the same level of this type of fundraising. So it's a really huge debate, and I don't really have the types of arguments really to be part of this debate or to support. So we can support about the visions, the cost for the student, but the reality to put boundaries of activities that the parent association want to engage is really out of our sense. But it's a situation that we are facing here, and we really don't want how to support or how to respond or country on this part.
Very interesting question. So, Agustin, I think of course we know it's not. Maybe we cannot open the debate now here because we are running a little bit out of time. But how to respond to such a situation, I think is. But what is the appropriate policy response? I think is here the question. So quite interesting, huh? Maybe George, and who has his hand up for a last intervention before we close.
Yes, just similar to what Gonzalez was putting. Actually, here when parents realized that government was giving almost peanuts many of the parents have defied the government directive of educating their children free. So what they are doing here, and it has been a very big debate here also, because government was just giving money for tuition, but children are not feeding. But the parents are saying, how can we send our children to school when they are not feeding? And how do we send to our children to schools that don't have an adequate classroom? So in areas where the parents are able, they are doing this, and they have defied the government. They are saying they need to invest in the education of their children, because here government saying, let the children go to school even when they are not eating. And you can see how crazy that one can be. How can children go to school when they are not feeding? So the parents are coming up, the very big debate here. So it is interesting. Maybe if we had time, we can talk. Anyway, we don't have time, but I have liked that because I think it is living with many of us. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you very much, George. That's another interesting policy issue, school feeding, and I think in your context, how to maintain it, because we all know that bringing it back to the issue of cost effectiveness, that this is really something which is a very strong instrument, actually. Number one, to bring kids to schools, from low income families, and also to give them the good conditions for learning. So I think it is fundamental issue. Okay, Laura, do you have anything more to add before we close?
No, I think we have covered all the main issues. I would like to encourage colleagues who have not yet submitted the assignment to do that. Remember that we have a quiz as well. And yes, just to reach out whenever you need to share something, or you have a question or a difficulty, don't hesitate to let us know. Melina is also available and looking forward to hearing from you. So here we are, don't hesitate. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. So with this reminder, then thank you very much to all of you for your active participation. I think today we had really nearly everyone was there, and one can see that the issue of funding and money is always interesting for every one of us. So great for your participation. Can we see? Can you put on your webcam if you have enough bandwidth so that we can see everyone? That's great. Yeah, wonderful. Huh? Yeah, so then I wish everyone, thank you, Amaranta, also for your great support, and Laura for the feedback, and wishing everyone a good week. Yeah, and enjoy module unit 6, I think.
Yeah.
See you next week.
Thank you.
Greetings from Paris. I can pull up my blind, and my office would be full of sunshine.
That's great. That's great.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye. Bye. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.